CIO of an organization, anywhere in between and kind of that management ranks, because DevOps has been around for a little while now, and organizations are scaling up and working on at all levels on how to make this successful within their organizations. So there'll be a lot of really good content focused on that and sharing stories, good and kind of the not so good, the things that we can learn lessons from. So the things I do want to highlight, we've got several activities that we're involved in. There's a lot more programming, a lot more content than what I'm just going to share with you here. So please check it all out. And if you haven't registered yet, go to the DevOps World 2020 site. You can Google it. It'll take you right there. And this, of course, is put on by the folks at CloudBees. So a couple of things that are happening. I just want to run through a few panels and talks and keynote. The first thing is on Tuesday, the opening day, is we have a panel, Show Me the Ugly Dogs. You might say that's kind of an interesting, funny title. And, there's we always hear about the cute puppy dog projects, the ones that always go well, or the DevOps rollouts that, oh yeah, I love to brag about the things that we did well and share the good news and share the lessons learned. The failures are just as equally valuable, and we all have them. We all have struggles. Sometimes there are small failures, sometimes big ones. And that's what this is about. Instead of talking about the puppies, it's about Show Me the Ugly Dogs. Now, joining me on the panel will be Gary Gruber, analyst with Accelerated Strategies Group, well-known personality within the DevOps world. Also is Hassan Yasser, who is with the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. Has some interesting data, so he works directly in this space. And then Sanjeev Sharma, who is a former analyst with Accelerated Strategies, now advisor, and he's also now with Truist in the banking industry. So he's a practitioner. So join us for that. Then the 22nd, we also have, that's at 1:30 p.m. in the afternoon. Earlier that day, there's a really great conversation or presentation that Sanjeev Sharma, who I just mentioned, with Truist is delivering, called Scaling Software Delivery, Challenges We Face 10 Years into the DevOps Movement. DevOps has been around for a while. It's hard to believe it's almost 10 years old. But it's, obviously taken hold and part of our fabric of where we are today. So it's good to kind of take stock of, what are the challenges that we faced at this point in the evolution of DevOps. Sanjeev will have a really good talk. I've not had a chance to hear this yet, but I know him very well, and I know his insights are extremely valuable. So that's on Tuesday, the 22nd. Then also going into Wednesday, we've got some really good things. First, coming up on that day at 6 a.m. is a keynote that I'm doing on State of Software Delivery Management, the report that we did for 2020. Really going through and highlighting some of the findings and learnings about software delivery management, where we are, what the challenges are, what's working well, et cetera. Now, Accelerated Strategies isn't just a survey group. Right, we're practitioners, very experienced in DevOps and cloud native and software development, product development, cybersecurity, AI, a number of things. It comes to us honestly, I should say. And while there's some great survey firms out there, our specialty is really having that background knowledge and expertise to both not to put together the research, but also to really understand what it says and kind of reading between the lines and doing some more digging to find those really valuable things. So I hope you'll join me for that. That's at 6 a.m. Pacific. The times I'm talking about on this Analyst Corner are all Pacific times. Then let's see, at 11:30 on Wednesday, the 23rd, we have another panel that I'll be moderating. It's about open source DevOps and its future in the enterprise. Of course, you probably aren't doing any software development if you're not using open source. It's pretty much a part of one of our main tools, our main sources of innovation, frankly, across so much of the software stack. So joining me on that panel will be Alan Schimmel, who is editor-in-chief at DevOps.com. He's also CEO of MediaOps, who brings you DevOps.com. And also Tracy Miranda, who is now with the Continuous Delivery Foundation. So she just switched over into a leadership role a couple of weeks prior, 3 or 4 weeks prior to the conference. So it's really talking about what we think the evolution of the business models and how it's leading to value creation and some things that are happening in the market today as well. So that'll be really great. Again, that's at 11:30 on Wednesday, the 23rd, 11:30 Pacific. And then there's a couple of really great talks on Wednesday. One prior to the panel I just mentioned is by Gary Groover. If you've read Gary Groover's latest book, Engineering the Digital Transformation, that's what he's going to be talking on. Of course, that book's been out for a little while now. And so he'll be sharing some really good experiences. And you probably know or heard of Gary. I don't know if you know his background, but he's led some very, very large organizations implementing, this is product organizations, implementing DevOps. And, I've talked about it a lot. I've heard him speak, of course. And he says that's some of the toughest time in his career, but also the most rewarding. So he has some really good experience to share with us. That's at 7:30 a.m. on Wednesday, Pacific time. And then Gary's also leading a workshop a little bit later that day at 1 Pacific. This is on Wednesday also. And he's going to be taking some of the concepts from that Engineering the Digital Transformation. And he calls it Making the Problem Visible. It's a mini workshop, and it can be done virtually. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this goes, but I think he can do some really fascinating things for you to help guide you through the process of, you can't really fix what's going on if you don't really understand the source of the problem. And so Gary's really good at getting to the heart of the matter with that. So there'll be some other activities. We're going to be launching some new research next week, hint, hint. And that'll be happening sometime around the beginning of the conference. So a little teaser there, kind of taking the work we did around software delivery management, maybe taking a little bit different direction and look at it more broadly across the organization. So don't want to say too much. I don't want to spoil the interesting information and insights that we have from that. So I hope you'll join us at DevOps World next week, DevOps World 2020. Happening on the 22nd through the rest of the week. There's really activities going all the time and tons of good content. I think if you look at the agenda, it's just kind of shocking, the quality and the quantity of high quality content and speakers. I know just looking at the submissions for the leadership track and how many we really had to sort through and examine and think about and consider so that we could get not to the best, but the best of the best. So it'll be a great conference. I look forward to seeing you there and joining you there together.
Join topic experts and peers for a Splunk virtual event. Observability to enable your digital initiatives. Are your apps and services distributed in the cloud, getting refactored as microservices, or becoming more complex? If they are, you must factor in observability. Observability is all your data to help you find unexpected failure conditions, explain why they happen, and resolve them fast. This event is about the challenges, opportunities, and best practices to successfully build observability into everything you develop, deliver, or monitor. Register today.
This is Digital Anarchist.
I'm joined today by Brett, who's CEO at Attack IQ, and we're going to be talking kind of CISO talk here. Brett, thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. And you look very comfortable, especially sporting that Stanford shirt. So I'm sure there's a big story about that. That's probably for another. How about if you introduce yourself, introduce Attack IQ?
Sure. So as you say, I'm Brett Galloway, the CEO of Attack IQ. We're a cybersecurity company. And our business is security control validation. The basic problem we solve is the security controls, of which enterprises now have many implemented, fail silently, right? You can't tell if a security control is working except by testing it actively, right? You may have a security control that detects a lot of intruders, and that's great, but what you really care about is how much it misses, and a security control by definition can't tell what it misses. And obviously enterprises know this. They have red teams in place. They do penetration tests in order to test their security controls. But the problem is you just can't test enough. Red team exercises a point in time. The coverage is terrible. The results are reproducible. And Verizon, for example, notes that 82% of successful breaches of enterprises should have been stopped by an existing control, but weren't. So the cybersecurity problem today is not that enterprises haven't implemented programs. The problem is that those programs are too porous because they're not tested enough. So our business is to help enterprises test their security controls at scale, in production, safely.
Great. Thanks for connecting the dots there. I thought we were doing a big setup. We're going to let everybody down. I'm going to tell you how you did it. So no, but thanks. That's awesome. So, and a great space to be in too, very much needed. So let's talk about, we're approaching budget season, if not already in budget season, certainly for large corporations on a calendar cycle. What's your sense of what the shifting priorities are today as you talk with customers around network security, of course, from maybe what they, of course, were, kind of pre-COVID activities?
Sure. COVID obviously is the big event this year. And I think there are two primary effects of COVID on CISOs. The first is the obvious effect, which is we have all these people now working at home, just like me. Mm-hmm. In ordinary times, I'd be sitting at the office. Now I'm sitting in my house. And having all of these employees at home requires you to do a few things. It requires you to build the infrastructure to support all of these employees. Larger enterprises will typically use VPNs for remote access, so they've had to hugely ramp up VPN capacity. And it also has required them to pay closer attention to the security of their endpoints. So this has been quite a boon for endpoint security software providers. Mm-hmm. So that's effect one. There's a corollary to that effect, which is that the adversaries know that all of this change is happening. They know the teams are distracted, so they're amping up their attacks. There's only one way you can expect cyber attacks to go over time, which is up.
Yeah, they're
more frequent, more sophisticated, and potentially more damaging.
That's interesting. I just saw, I think it was University of Utah just announced they'd paid a ransom for some ransomware attack on them. Yeah, it's a constant battle, definitely not going away. And as you said, everybody had to shift within less than a week in many cases, not very much notice, and might put strain on current systems, and folks did what they had to do to be able to support the business. But now let's go back and kind of shore up what we lacked and get some better management capabilities, device management, device security, maybe some better identity management. Of course, now you talk about a porous network, because a lot of those folks are not going over VPNs who don't require that kind of access. So the landscape's really changed radically in some ways.
Well, it has, and that's the conventional consequence. Mm-hmm. I think the more enduring and less obvious consequence is the effect on people's budgets. Right. The second effect of COVID is economic contraction. So every business today is facing a tougher business environment, with the small exception of companies that are actively profiting from it, like Zoom.
Yep.
The company that is hosting this conference. But everybody else is having to deal with tighter budgets. And this comes at an interesting time for cybersecurity. Cybersecurity has been enjoying a huge build-out boom for the last 12 years. Mm-hmm. If you look at an industry level, every year budgets are higher this year over last, so a very high CAGR, compound annual growth rate. And this has been driven by a very real realization, which is 12 years ago, the industry in the aggregate was way underinvested in cybersecurity. So it was appropriate for the industry to invest. So you've seen companies move from, I've got firewalls and antivirus. Aren't I good?
I went through my own, kind of early in that time frame, I went through my own, let's completely redo the security architecture. This is inadequate as I went to a company.
Well, exactly. So, so you've had sort of the, real CISOs and multiply in enterprises. You've seen budgets expand. You've seen teams expand. You've seen enterprises, create real professional security operations. And that's been fueled by budget increases. Pre-COVID, Gartner was already forecasting that this was going to slow down. Mm-hmm. No tree grows to the sky. At some point, you've got enough budget, And what COVID, I believe, is really done, it has accelerated that shift in the slope of the budget growth line.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's variation. We certainly have accounts or prospects that have slashed security budgets because they're having to slash budgets across the whole business.
They're survival mode and things like that.
They're in survival mode. But most businesses are not slashing budgets. But what they're not doing is they're not growing budgets.
Mm-hmm.
And what this really reflects is, I believe, a need for the CISO function to mature. If you're focused on build out, then obviously you just got to build out. But at some point you have to ask questions like, is this stuff working? Am I getting return on my investment in cybersecurity?
Mm-hmm.
How much is enough? And these are absolutely questions that the business has been asking, and now those questions are ramping up in their intensity.
In some ways, I agree with what you're saying, Brett. I think there's another kind of path through that logic, which is they're being asked to be much fiscally astute leaders because many businesses, of course, they've accelerated the move to the cloud. They're maybe making even greater investments in digital transformation, digital experiences for customers, contact services, whatever it may be. But they're investing in applications. And at the same time, sort of application security, API security, Kubernetes, containers, all of those things, and sort of the architecture of the applications have changed. And so they're potentially more porous, more accessible, more vulnerable, but there's no more budget. So you've got to figure out how do you do that too, and do everything you were doing before, if it makes sense still to do it.
Well, exactly. The CISO has an interesting challenge. Not the technical challenge of defending a cyber attack, but they have an interesting business challenge, which is they have to deal with change. And the drivers of change in cybersecurity are quite rapid and intense. And there's three different major drivers. The first is the one you name, which is changes in the business. Mm-hmm. Right? Work from home through that lens is just another change in the business. Just like move to cloud, just like introduction of a new application, the business is going to keep making changes, and they're going to keep requiring the CISO to adapt to support all of that change. It's just a hard requirement. But that's not the only change. They also have to deal with change in the threat environment, right? Because the adversaries don't stay static either. And between those, they have to deal with change in the vendor environment, right? There's a huge endpoint security replacement cycle going on that's driven not just by changes in the threat environment, but by changes in the technology that's available that improve the quality of their defenses. So you have to deal with changes in the vendor environment. So the CISO's job is very dynamic.
I think you also have, I agree with what you're saying, that you also have the fact that how people work means the change, meaning the tools that they're changing or the amount that they're using. Sorry, that's my security dog. He's taking care of some business here. So, but you're much more heavy use of SaaS applications, shared file storage, collaboration services that maybe, a tenth of the company heavily used. Now everybody's using them, or half of the company. So you've really had this big shift in where activity is occurring in terms of applications and tools, and where data is living, and who knows what's on somebody's home gaming computer versus on what should be a work laptop.
No, that's absolutely correct. And pity the CISO though, right? The CISO has gotten used to a world where the primary way to deal with change is by adding stuff. Right, so the number of vendors has exploded. The number of controls has exploded.
There's a problem.
Exploded.
Fix it, right?
Team sizes have gotten much bigger, and that's great and appropriate. But now they're going to keep having to deal with change. They're going to keep having to be dynamic, and they're not going to be able to add people. Right? In many organizations, hiring is slowed way down, and so they need to develop some disciplines that require them to keep dealing with change, to keep protecting the organization, but also they require them to ask the same questions the business is asking. How much is enough? Am I getting getting a return from my investments? Are the various organizations that I've created performing well? And these are disciplines that most business leaders are familiar with, but CISOs have not had to do this quite as much. And to be fair, I'm not saying that CISOs haven't had to deal with budget constraints. That's obviously always.
I totally understand it, but it's a much different situation where now it's swung the other way.
Correct.
Now we aren't getting more money. Now you aren't getting more people. And I still want you to do everything you were supposed to do plus, right?
And I want you to improve effectiveness because it wasn't high enough. And I want you to support work from home and this and this and this and this. And I don't ever want to see any regression in our security posture. Mm-hmm. Deal with it, dude.
I'm saying this a bit, maybe mostly facetiously, but you think we're going to see kind of continuous improvement, sort of TQM methodologies implemented by security leaders so that you really have measurable data about what is being effective? How do I know? How do I measure it? Those kind of philosophies creeping in more readily, more steadily as a skill set or a tool that CISOs need to use?
I really think so. And the current situation in cybersecurity reminds me of what happened at the end of the 90s. For those listeners who remember that.
A lot of things happened at the end of the 90s, but okay.
Well, so the 90s was a huge build-out boom for IT.
Yeah.
Budgets were going up. You had implementation of large, huge improvements in infrastructure.
You breathe, I'll hire you for IT.
Systems. You had migration, for Y2K, right? And so the point is the whole industry was building out. And then the party ended in 2000 and 2001. And there were several years that went by where the real topic of discussion at the level of CIO was, how do I keep the lights on and do new things?
Mm-hmm.
How do I deal with the fact that budgets are no longer going up? The budgets are kind of flattish. And what they gave birth to is exactly what you're describing. TQM, an emphasis on service management, a creation of portfolio discipline, the implementation of continuous productivity programs, not as a one-time budget event, but as an ongoing process that could free up budget to be able to do new things. That required measurement. It required definition of effectiveness. It required a bunch of business practices to be developed at an industry level. And today, people don't talk about this anymore because CIOs have figured out how to do this. That's just part of the job.
I remember in those days, as a CIO, if your budget incremented 2% a year, you were thrilled.
Correct.
Your peers did not have that luxury.
Correct. It isn't that I don't think that security budgets will continue to increase over time, but I think they'll increase a lot more slowly. And so, it would be wise to start to prepare for this, to start thinking about how do I implement, how do I think about portfolio discipline and productivity improvement and an assessment of effectiveness of my security program as an ongoing discipline.
Yeah, and this is not comment on the maturity of CISOs and their leadership skills, but one of the things often that helps when you're in kind of dire circumstances or you're in kind of trimmed down mode is there's so much momentum built up around what you already are doing that the organization and you start to believe that you have to do it. It's a requirement. Right. I had somebody told me that you have to bring the cable into slat 3 because that's where that card has to go. And I said, no, that's where it goes because I had a shorter cable that time. But the whole organization believes it has to work that way. So one of the ways of breaking that cycle is zero-based budgeting. Let's step back with our security strategy. Let's build it back. Now, we're not going to stop what we're doing, but let's start our kind of planning and architecture bottom up again and really rethink, what we implemented 10 years ago. There's a much better way to do that now. And how would we, make those kinds of shifts? Do you think that's going to be part of what this sort of portfolio of activities that CISOs and other security leaders are going to need to take on?
Absolutely. When I say portfolio discipline, I mean exactly that process, right? Mm-hmm. Looking at your portfolio of existing capabilities, determining their utility, improving them or eliminating them or replacing them. And, and that for the CISO today is very hard. And in some respects, it's harder for the CISO than it was the CIO for the same reason I mentioned earlier. Just like security controls effectiveness can't be determined, the effectiveness of the whole security program actually cannot be determined. Mm-hmm. Right? As CIO, it's pretty easy. Either I delivered, this capability or I didn't. But if, let's say I put a whole security program in place based on some set of architectural standards, how do I evaluate whether that's meeting the need or not? I can't. So It is very hard to drive this ongoing optimization process without better instrumentation.
It's almost like I used to talk about security as you sell it like insurance. It's how much insurance do you need? What kind of coverage do you need? And that's in that you don't know how much you need. How much do I need enough that I don't need to spend anymore, right? Whatever I can get away with is not the minimum, but what do I really need to be spending? So, to your point, it's getting back to how do we measure the effectiveness of what we have in situations like talking about what Attack IQ does to help people understand, more in real time, more proactively, what's not working, what is working, as well as what is working. I also think that we're in a world of sort of data exhaust because we collect so much data about our applications, about the network, about security systems. We throw them into, systems that help sift that down into threat responses and ways to manage that. But there's also that data can also be turned sideways and kind of used as one of the sources of information to say, for what we pay, that's an awful lot of human or digital or dollar resource going to solve that problem.
Well, exactly. But if you look at it, is true that CISOs have a flood of data. What I don't think they have is a flood of information.
I agree with that.
And a lot of that data is activity-oriented data, right? I'm doing this, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing this. One of the visual metaphors I like to use is, a threat hunter is like a guy with a fly swatter, right? And he's busily swatting flies. He's reporting on how many flies he swatted, and he's excited that he's swatted a bunch of flies. But what you care about is the hornets that he didn't hit, right? That flew by. And that's the missing information that actually matters. Because at the end of the day, you don't care how many flies you swatted. You care about how often you got stung.
I'm wondering too, not predicting dire consequences for CISOs, but I remember using the 2000s as an analogy. I used to say the lifespan of a CIO is about 6 months. And part of it was some of those business skills, right? To be able to really effectively manage. So that maybe that's something CISOs can take to heart and really learn from working with their counterparts, the CIO, certainly the CFO, and helping build up some of those skills and finding ways to, how do we know what I don't know, right? Finding out what's effective and not.
Well, I was chatting with a woman last night, actually, and she's a director of a public company, and she was complaining about the challenge of recruiting a CISO. And they had recruited a CISO who was very technical, and that CISO couldn't communicate to the board. And so in due course, they fired the CISO, and they hired the CISO with a governance, risk, and compliance background who could totally talk to the board, but couldn't run the security function at all, had no technical chops. And so they fired that person, and they replaced him with a very technical person who can't communicate with the board. So this is not a them problem. It's an industry problem. Mm-hmm. Because the reason why a technical CISO can't communicate with the board is because there's no way to frame what they're doing technically in a business context.
Right.
If you look at risk management, today, cyber risk management is a top-down exercise of projecting lists and assessing risks. There's a bottom-up threat management view, which is dealing with all the threats and the technologies and the controls and so on. And today, there's no way to tangibly connect those two things. So the risk view says, yes, we have a firewall, check, good to go. So what?
Yeah, what's a firewall again?
Who says it's working? Who says it's configured correctly? Who says that it's architected correctly? Who says that that's even relevant to the threat environment that we face?
Well, I know a lot of really good B schools. You're wearing one on your shirt, and executive MBA programs. I'm serious. Those would be some great things for CISOs to bone up on their skills. Right now it'd be a great time to go sign up for some of those programs or take some, executive education, leadership education on those, because if one of the big skills you walk out of B school with is business case, right? Analysis, case analysis, all of that thing where you go back and look at past history. Well, that's kind of what you need to do here. Obviously in a more technical, but still it's the same parameters, right? Have these things happening. We're spending this kind of money. We got this, we didn't get that, we failed, we succeeded for these reasons. It teaches you that analytical knowledge and process of how to assess those situations.
Well, exactly. But I do think the CISO has one more problem, which is a lot of the information they need to develop those practices don't exist. And, obviously this is where we come in as a vendor. Earlier I'd said that security controls fail silently because they're hard to observe. The same is true of the overall security program. So we recently launched what we call the security optimization platform. And it came out of a very simple observation. Our product today is primarily sold at director level to do security control validation. So, maybe a director of SecOps is using us to test security controls, find configuration drift, figure out what's not configured correctly, and fix it. And that's a good value proposition. But it turns out that across our customer base, we identified 26 different use cases for our product, not just that one. Very surprising result. And what they all reflected was ways to use this visibility into control effectiveness to improve some function in the security program. Mm-hmm. For example, one of our use cases is doing evaluations of new products when they're purchasing them. Right? So you're considering an endpoint software EDR upgrade or EDR eval. How do you evaluate all those products? Well, people use us to do that because they can map, they can programmatically assess those controls against the MITRE attack matrix with which we're closely aligned, and they can use that to then determine which tools they best believe will defend them against the threat environment they face. You can do the same thing at renewal time to say, how much is this particular control worth to me based on my real threat environment and my ability to measure its effectiveness. Mm-hmm. Another use case is people doing training exercises. Very hard to train threat hunters. We let you train those threat hunters in your production environment as opposed to training them in a sandbox or cyber range, right? So, but these all derive from the same capability of being able to shine a spotlight on the effectiveness of a thing and then use that to improve the performance of that function in the security organization.
I'm curious if this is another use case for you, for your company. And that is, there's a lot of, I've talked about the data that's kind of thrown off through security tools and processes. That actually can be extremely effective in an M&A kind of situation. You may be buying assets of a company. You may be buying, portions of what's still left of a company, or merging, doing all those kinds of activities. And there's so much information because, security systems, maybe they don't see all, but they see a lot. Or you need to make decisions about, they have a very effective program. We think we have a better program. Well, how do you know?
How do you know?
Besides an opinion or picking winners and losers, it's nice to have some data. You want to be a data-driven, decision-driven organization and leader. That's a great way to do it.
You're absolutely correct. And there are two different M&A use cases we see. One is on the front side. How do I evaluate an acquiree to understand how aggressively I should prioritize remediating.
Mm-hmm.
And number two is consolidation. Many companies are facing that. They've done lots of M&A. They have a bunch of different vendors and a bunch of different architectures, and that's operationally complex, which leads to failures, and it's also expensive. And this is the sort of era where people start saying, let's simplify, let's homogenize, let's not just because we can save money, but because if I have fewer tools, I need fewer people to administer them, and my error rates go down. And as I said earlier, error rate is a huge contributor to susceptibility to cyber attack. And so these are two of those 26 use cases, actually, that we see customers doing. So you're absolutely correct.
I use this example. Interesting that you were at Cisco back in 2008 because of the downturn then. One of the things, there was a Harvard Business Review study on how Cisco remade their strategy for supply chains. So instead of, you're my optical manufacturer for that equipment, you're this manufacturer. No, I'm going to flip the opposite. I want a dozen people that can make my products, my optical products, because I need to be able, you may be gone tomorrow. You may be a better partner to work with. And as companies rebuild and accelerate out of an economic downturn, supply chains are going to change significantly in some cases. And now the CISO is faced with, okay, I had things well in place with our current partners and the pace of change. If we're remaking all of that all at once, how do I take on that kind of an effort?
No, that's absolutely true. And you absolutely, we do see CISOs who will intentionally have a multi-vendor strategy because they want robustness. If you do that, though, you want to do it in a conscious and thoughtful way, which means you can define what your what's the underlying metric of robustness. Mm-hmm. Right? You don't, and the same is true even in supply chain at Cisco, right? It's not enough just to say I have 3 vendors. If all 3 vendors end up manufacturing exactly the same factory.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So you have to trace it all the way back.
Really pay attention to the details. Mm-hmm. And what really informed, Cisco's efforts to create a more robust supply chain was more information about what were the real critical failure modes of the whole supply chain. Just having vendors for the sake of vendors actually turns out to be a very poor strategy.
It's a very costly strategy.
As well as being costly, yeah. But it's poor in the sense you don't really get the robustness you need. A friend of mine was, complained one time. He was at a large bank, and they had supposedly a dual redundant WAN connection. And of course, the problem was the dual redundant WAN connection went through the exact same choke point that failed. Mm-hmm. Backhoe took it all out at the same time. So it turned out not to be dual redundant at all.
Just takes that one point where there's only one conduit underneath the parking lot, right?
Exactly.
That's really helpful.
What you want is your redundancy to be real and mapped to capabilities that you can measure, you can define, measure, and validate.
Well, and those service providers aren't static either. Their environment changes. What's redundant today may not be redundant tomorrow.
Exactly. Which comes back to one of the sources of change, which is, the vendor environment that CISOs face is constantly changing. Mm-hmm. There's new companies with new capabilities like us. There's also existing vendors whose capabilities change. They have to evaluate. There are, a very high rate of acquisition in our space, and very frequently after startups are bought, the team decamps and the capabilities decline. All of these are things that you have to deal with as a CISO. My ambition for Attack IQ is to actually help, not help with the problem of vendors changing, but to help CISOs with this practical problem of maturing their practices, mm-hmm. and in making their operations not only more effective, that's always a requirement, but also making them more productive and more efficient.
If you do that for them, I'm sure they would appreciate that.
Yeah, it's a tough job. Not only, as you say, the CISOs, famously suffer short tenures, but they even have high rates of mental health issues, high rates of substance abuse.
It's a high pressure job.
It is a very high pressure job, and it is in many respects a can't win kind of job.
Mm-hmm.
They
don't call you into the boardroom when things are going well.
No, in businesses, risk is a given in business. Everyone knows about risk. Everyone deals with risk. Nobody wants to eliminate risk. They know it's impossible. What they want is they want to manage risk. And I think from the business's perspective, cyber risk feels like the risk of a lightning strike, right? Mm-hmm. You're walking out in the field. You got to walk out in the field, and you're just hoping the lightning strikes somebody else and not you. Mm-hmm. That's not managing your risks. That's enduring a risk.
No, it's more akin to use your analogy. Lightning is going to strike. We just need to put lightning rods on the roof to make sure when it does.
Exactly. And to the point of the Verizon result, right? The lightning rod is either not in place or it fails way too often. Mm-hmm. And therein lies the tail. That represents the opportunity for us as a vendor to help, certainly. But I think it also represents the opportunity for the industry to turn a corner on both efficiency and effectiveness. Mm-hmm. Because the reality is the industry is neither effective nor efficient today. And the business needs it to be effective and efficient. But it's not just the business that needs it. I mean, we need it as consumers. Mm-hmm. When I left Cisco, with two beliefs about security. One was that it matters deeply, but that was really informed by work where I got read in that Cisco was doing with some of our more advanced customers on cyber. And it was scary in 2011, right? How susceptible we are as a society to cyber attack. We are as a society adding more and more software to our world. Mm-hmm. And that's great, and it's driving productivity and efficiency and speed.
Drives our economy, yeah.
And it's amazing, but that software comes with bugs, and some of those bugs are vulnerabilities. And so what we're doing is we're making our world more vulnerable. And, we're seeing, what happened with a world that was vulnerable to viral attack, right? The world is also highly susceptible to cyber attack. And the controls that we have collectively put in place to protect us are not very good. Mm-hmm. All right, this is a fact. You can even see it in the Twitter hack, right? Well,
think about all those passwords that people have created for whatever third-party SaaS service and no password managers, and
exactly.
I think that's a gold mine sitting there wide open for attack. Compromise.
Exactly. But despite the huge increase in investment, the breaches keep getting worse.
Mm-hmm. They do.
And this is I believe the fundamental call to action for us as an industry. Now that call to action has gotten harder because we can't just keep spending more and more and more and more and more. So ultimately, we as an industry have to figure out how to get better.
If it's a big enough forcing function, it will cause action. Right. And maybe that's where we are. Well, I'd love to chat with you more. Hope you'll come back. Love to hear how things are going as we move into the new year and some of those budgets shift and people are, putting more emphasis on measuring effectiveness and maybe some best practices that you're seeing with customers. I think that'd be really interesting to share with folks. So I hope you'll come back.
Yeah, I've enjoyed the conversation and look forward to talking again.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining me, Brett Galloway, who's CEO with Attack IQ.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hiring great DevOps and cyber talent is a huge challenge for technical teams. Cloud transformation is driving demand higher. You've tried doing it yourself. Job boards, LinkedIn, didn't work. Recruiters are an option, but who do you trust and not waste your time and money? RecruitOps is the new way to source engineering talent. From Media Ops, the people behind DevOps.com, Security Boulevard, Container Journal, and more. We sit right in the middle of the hottest positions in Dev, Sec, and Ops, and the brightest minds in the field. If you're looking for a great position or the talent to fill it, we can help you. Trust us, risk-free.
Hey, thanks, Mitchell. Great stuff there. Hey, thanks for sticking around till the end of today's show. I want to make a special announcement. If you're here tomorrow, we have a special edition of TechStrong TV on Wednesday, 2:30 Eastern Time. I'm going to be joined by all three co-founders of JFrog, Fred Simon, Yov Landsman, and Shlomi Ben Chaim, the three co-founders of JFrog, on what is a really, really big day for them. They've got some really big news. We'll be talking about it. Join us at 2:30 on the regular Digital Anarchist Network. However you're watching this, you'll be able to watch it tomorrow at 2:30. Until then, though, hope you've had a great day. I hope you're having a great week so far. This is Alan Schimmel. Be safe, be well, be strong, tech strong.